Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take part in another wonderful BookTuber tag. This tag is called the 2025 Nonfiction Book Tag, and it was the original tag of Julie over at Bookish Travels 1. And Julie also has a wonderful channel where she explores children's literature and YA literature. So Julie is quite the creative dynamo. And I was tagged for this by both Julie and Nicole over at Nicole's Bookish Nook. And oh my goodness, Nicole, she's of course the mastermind behind the Celtophile readathon that starts next month, which I am really looking forward to. I'm very excited about this celebration of the Celtic imagination. And Nicole, of course, is also a writer herself of poetry, of horror, of fantasy. So she combines her love of BookTube with writing. So I am so thankful to Julie and to Nicole for the tag and for creating this wonderful tag and including me in it. The 2025 Nonfiction Book Tag. We'll see how we go. All right, the first prompt. What motivated you to pick up your first nonfiction book, and what can you remember of it? Well, for me, my first nonfiction book would have been a beautiful children's illustrated copy of the Bible, the Christian Bible, but that both the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament. That would have been my first nonfiction book. Theologians and Bible scholars I'll leave them to tease out the whole thing about how much of it is fiction and how much of it is non-fiction. That's a wonderful thing to think about, isn't it? The other thing that would have been my next off the list of an early non-fiction book would have been works by Billy Graham. I grew up in a home that was very much in that evangelical Protestant tradition. And the only books in my home growing up were books, the Bible, and books by Billy Graham. So yes, my earliest works of non-fiction, a children's illustrated Bible, and then as I got a little bit older as a teenager, I would have grown into reading with my mum and dad the works of Billy Graham. There you go. Number 2, how do you choose your next non-fiction read? I think a lot of my discoveries are via YouTube. When I'm not on BookTube specifically, I subscribe to a lot of channels to do with philosophy, theology, particularly around things like consciousness, God, ethics, aesthetics, consciousness, free will. And so a lot of the things, my discoveries, new non-fiction things I want to read, are probably first via YouTube. And then at the moment, I'm also writing an autobiographical verse novel to be called Hounded. And of course, I'm a reader and a writer. So for me, writing an autobiography is often me just sitting in this chair reading a book. So my autobiography, a lot of it is about the books that I am reading. A long while ago, 20, 30 years ago, my 2 younger brothers both passed away in accidents 10 weeks apart. And after my 2 brothers, after Matthew and Danny's deaths, I must admit I spent a lot of time searching out works of philosophy, theology around, death and bereavement. And I read a lot of medical science stuff too, about what it was like to actually die and maybe what happened after death and the different stages of that grieving process. I read a lot of that. So at the moment, I'm rereading a lot of these things as I get ready to write, as I said, this autobiographical verse novel. The chapter I'm currently writing is very much me back in that period after the deaths of my brothers. So I'm revisiting a lot of those books. So at the moment, I've got books like this one, this amazing philosopher, John Bowker, who's written this book, The Meanings of Death. This is a fabulous book. It's a really rich, tradition in that analytic philosophy tradition. But he's really looking at death and bereavement and putting it into a much bigger, almost an anthropological context. This is a marvelous book. It had a big impact on me after the deaths of Matthew and Danny. That was 30 years ago. So it's been a lot of fun revisiting this as I'm now writing this autobiographical verse novel. So John Bowker, The Meanings of Death. I've got this book by Timothy Taylor, The Buried Soul. This one by Alison Morgan, What Happens When We Die. This is much more, of course, from a medical science point of view. So this is, really medical science exploring what is it like to die, what happens to the body during the process of dying. I became quite obsessed with these sort of things, my way of dealing with what had happened, I guess. I've got this one by Sherwin Nuland, How We Die, another book on medical science, looking at, what happens. This one, Paul Badham is, I think, an Anglican priest, and this is a book called Christian Beliefs About Life After Death. So this is a wonderful book, sort of from a theological, anthropological perspective, looking at how death and bereavement has been dealt with from a more pastoral issue in the that very rich Anglican Episcopalian tradition. It's a great book. I haven't read it for a long time, but I am really looking forward to re-exploring it now. Then I've got this book by Nigel, Barley, Dancing on the Grave, Encounters with Death. This is very much, a work by a contemporary anthropologist looking at, Western societies and comparing that with other ways of dying and death and bereavement with other non-Western societies. It's a wonderful book, very rich, so much, of that rich, really rich anthropological tradition. And then I've just bought this as well. This is this newest book by Rachel and Ross Menzies. This is a book called Mortals, How the Fear of Death Shaped Human Society. This is not a book I've even read yet. This is a brand new book that my psychologist advised me to go and buy. So I'm reading this for him. I can't wait to read this. I've actually had it a couple of months, but I still haven't read it. So I can't wait to read this and bring it into this chapter I'm currently writing with Hounded. We'll see how we go, but this looks like it's going to be an absolute hoot. So there you go, how I choose my next book, my next non-fiction book, all of those sorts of things. 3, do you annotate your non-fiction books? No, definitely not. I love the idea of a book as cultural artifact, and every book is an absolute treasure that I love to look after. I'm hoping my library will go to my grandchildren after I die, and that they will love my books as much as I have loved them. I hope. So no, I don't annotate or do anything to damage a book. 4, have you read a non-fiction book that has challenged your beliefs or assumptions? Probably not for a long while. I think as we get older, we get more conservative, don't we? We live in our own little thought bubble and we continue to buy books that actually reinforce. So, I am a very progressive left of centre thinker, and they're the sort of books I buy, which are, in a sense, I suppose, they're all adding to my knowledge. They're all taking me down different rabbit holes of thought, of exploration. But I guess I'm not really reading anything that radically challenges my point of view. For example, now I wouldn't be capable of reading anything about Trump or by the Christian right, by Billy Graham. I avoid all of that sort of thing. So I guess I'm not a very courageous reader anymore. I guess I'm not choosing books to read that do really radically challenge my beliefs and unsettle my beliefs. I probably look more for reinforcement than challenge, I'm afraid to say. Certainly as a young adult, I really enjoyed reading books, particularly non-fiction books that really challenged me. When I went to Sydney University to do my Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy, History and English, I loved reading really radical left of centre stuff. You know, I went to Sydney University at the age of 18. I'm very much a good Protestant Christian little boy. I was a fundamentalist Christian. You know, I believed in a literal Noah's Ark, literal creation, 4000 BC, whatever it was. The whole thing. And, you know, being exposed at Sydney University to Darwin and Marx and the Frankfurt School and Gramsci, and oh boy, it just blew my mind. So yes, as a young adult, I was probably much better at really seeking out books and being much more open to books that would really unsettle and change the way I thought. And oh my goodness, my whole life, has just been shaped by the reading of these sort of things now. I wish I still had that courage and I could read books that would really unsettle and challenge me. But I probably at the moment lacking now a little bit of courage, I think. 5. How do you feel about the intersection of storytelling and factual content in non-fiction? Well, just because a work is a work of non-fiction, I think personally it still should be written really well. So the idea of storytelling in non-fiction I love, particularly if that really prioritizes, as I just said, the writing of the work. You know, I don't think a work should be just there to survive because of its contents. It should be well written. It should be readable and engageable. I also don't like works by some philosophers, for example, who really deliberately set out to be obtuse and difficult and almost as though they're trying to complicate meaning. You know, if you are a writer, I think it is about communication and you are trying to communicate, to engage. I think that's part of the contract between a writer and a reader. So yes, I think non-fiction should be well written, and I love the idea of writing non-fiction as a great story. In Australia, the late 20th century, we had a very famous historian called Manning Clark. Manning Clark, this is a wonderful biography of Manning Clark by Mark McKenna. Manning Clark was this wonderful historian who he had a great commitment to writing history as a great story. When Manning Clark was asked, you know, who are his greatest models, you know, when he wrote his great history of Australia, and he wrote this terrific, great big 6-volume, multi-volume history of Australia. This is just volume 6 of this 6-volume thing that he wrote, this huge masterpiece of Australian history. But when Manning Clark wrote this stuff, he was always asked, of course, you know, who were his great models? Who did he try and write history like? And for him, his answer was always, believe it or not, Dostoevsky. You know, Dostoevsky was the great writer for Manning Clark, and he wanted to do all his writing of history as though they were a Dostoevsky novel. And Manning Clark had this one, because he was a very progressive left-of-centre thinker, got him into a lot of trouble with the more conservative elements within Australian society. Manning Clark always had this idea that he divided all the great historical figures that were, you know, he was writing about in his multi-volume history of Australia. He divided all of these people up into either narrowers, straighteners of the human condition, or enlargers of the human condition. So every person, every persona he created to walk through the pages of his multi-volume history of Australia, he either wrote about them as though they were an enlarger of the human spirit, you know, a progressive person, opening things up, inclusive, welcoming, or they were narrowers, straighteners, trying to, you know, keep a lid on everything. As you can imagine, he got into a lot of trouble with conservative people in Australia. And Manning Clark is one of those historians who you either love, like me, or you detest. He had a lot of people who hated him. And it is also true. Manning Clark never let facts get in the way of a good story. So, you know, his wonderful multi-volume history of Australia, written like Dostoevsky novels, they're fantastic books to read. The richness of the drama, the sense of occasion, the way he evokes these characters to walk through his pages of history, they really are really well-written books. They're a terrific thing to read. but they do contain quite a few factual errors, and he has got into a lot of trouble for that by more conservative critics and scholars. So yes, Manning Clark, the historian in Australia you either love or hate. I love him. Where are we up to? Number 6. Is there a topic you wish authors would explore? If I had a non-fiction topic that I wish could be explored, because I think we live in a society now where there are so many books and publication, production, everything is so rich, and everybody who writes, nearly always anyway, are trying to write something that no one has written before. So, geez, really, in world publishing, if you can't find something new, something to really engross your attention, I think you're not looking very hard. Probably everything that you want out there is out there somewhere for you to explore. But if there was to be one thing that I would love to get my hands on, at the moment there's a young British philosopher who's just become a Christian, and he's just written a book called Why, which explores some of the intellectual foundations that have allowed him to return to his Christian faith. But he's also a great philosopher of what's called panpsychism. So he's a professor of philosophy in the United Kingdom, up in the north, in the Midlands. And he's run a lot of work on the philosophy around panpsychism. This idea that, physics tells this rich story about what matter is, about how matter behaves. The physicists describe how matter behaves, how it reacts, how one thing reacts to another thing. But what physics doesn't do is really tell us what matter actually is. Likewise, consciousness. We know what it's like to be conscious, but at the moment we don't have any idea about what consciousness actually is. And so Philip Goff has spent a lot of time, as well as writing about his return to his Christian faith, he's developed this idea around panpsychism, that maybe, consciousness is matter and matter is consciousness. So at the very core of our experience, at the very core of the universe, is in fact consciousness. And whether you call that God or just consciousness, he would now call it probably God. That God is consciousness and consciousness is God. And God is at the center of the universe and is breathed into everything. So I really love Philip Goff. I really love chasing down his works. But I've also discovered recently, there's this North American, I'm not sure whether she's American or Canadian, but her name is Mary Jane Rubenstein. She's a wonderful pantheist, and she's got this idea going back to Baruch Spinoza, that wonderful Jewish European scholar from, what was it, the 16th or the 17th century. She's got this wonderful idea of pantheism, and she explores that going, as I said, back to Spinoza and then bringing it forward to the 21st century. So she's got this whole project to reimagine God, to reimagine what God is, so that it's not only evangelical, Protestant or conservative Catholic folk or, any other religious tradition. She wants to widen things right out and to re-explore ideas of God, reimagine God from a pantheist tradition. So that once again, like Baruch Spinoza, God is nature, nature is God. The idea of God that even Albert Einstein said he loved. When Einstein was asked, do you believe in God? He said, well, I believe in Spinoza's God. And that was this pantheist idea. So Mary Jane Rubenstein has written all of these wonderful books that you can see I can have here. Exploring pantheism and trying to reimagine rebreathe new life into pantheism. These are just wonderful books. I love Mary Jane Rubenstein. If you're interested in Mary Jane Rubenstein, she interviews really well. So there's a lot of YouTube interviews and lectures by her and with her where she talks about all of these big ideas, and she really gives her ideas around pantheism. But what I would love, the book that I would love, would be if Mary Jane Rubenstein was able to team up with Philip Goff, because I really would be really interested in bringing together panpsychism with pantheism. So that panpsychism is not only exploring consciousness, the origins of consciousness, what consciousness is, where does it come from, but linking that up with the pantheism, so that maybe God is nature, nature is God, but also God is consciousness and consciousness is God. So God is again at the center of everything, breathing fire into the equations. I'd be really interested in that. So I would love it if Philip Goff got together with Mary Jane Rubenstein and together they brought together the panpsychism vision with the pantheism vision and see where we could go. That would be an absolute hoot to read. Philip Goff and Mary Jane Rubenstein, they both interview really well. And as I said, there are lots of interviews with them on YouTube if you would like to follow it up. All right. 7. Do you incorporate insights from nonfiction into your daily life? Well, in the sense that, books are always adding to my knowledge and changing the way I, think I want to be in the world. Yes, certainly. I probably don't read any self-help books if this question is more about that. I probably should read more self-help books because I have a lot of psychological problems and a lot of issues with bereavement, a lot of unresolved tensions and problems. So do I incorporate? Well, yes and no, I guess, not in a self-help type of way, not in a really concrete, explicit way. But, I spend my whole life now, I earn my living off reading and writing. I'm always writing reviews. That's how I now make my bread and butter. So I guess, I'm always reading books, living with the ideas of them and then trying to turn them into a review. Or I also write a lot of blurbs for books because I have a job as an editor with Recent Work Press in Canberra. So I do a lot of editing, a lot of blurb writing for Recent Work Press, which is predominantly a small poetry press, but they publish some other things as well. 8. Choose one book from your nonfiction collection to highlight. Well, I'm going to go to my great love affair with the Folio Society. You've seen this wonderful thing sitting just back over my left shoulder in all of my videos. Maybe you've been wondering, what is that? It looks like it would be an amazing work, maybe of high fantasy or something like that. And look at this slipcase. It's absolutely magnificent, isn't it? What the book actually is the libretto of Richard Wagner's massive Ring Cycle, that great opera series. 3 massive operas retelling the great story of Sigurd and the Ring. So this is Richard Wagner's libretto from that opera. You can see the wonderful gold at the top to keep dust off the pages. Look at that cover. It's an amazing book. Look at those end papers. They're so rich. Oh boy. If you're going to read the libretto of Richard Wagner's opera series, I think it has to be in a book like this. The grandiosity of this really suits the project. And this comes with amazing introductory material, looking at the history of the Ring Cycle and how it's been staged. So, lots of photographs of actors, opera singers, settings, lots of really good introductory stuff, looking at how this, as I said, the history of the opera and the history of its reception. And then you've got the actual words of the libretto. I love fantasy. I love any stories about dragons and monsters. So this is an absolute hoot to read. It's an absolute, and everything with the Folio Society. It just opens so beautifully in the hand. Every section begins with a beautiful illustration, like a traditional woodcut type thing like that. It's an amazing book, this. It's just beautiful to read, and I just have a ball reading this. The Ring Cycle of Wagner was so important to, people like, for example, all the Inklings, all the fantasy that C.S. Lewis wrote, J.R.R. Tolkien. A lot of them went back, when they weren't reading things like William Morris and George MacDonald and, Lewis Carroll even, they were going back to the Ring Cycle, So this has had a massive impact, in fact, on 20th and 21st century fantasy. Almost any fantasy series that has dragons in it would in some way go back to the Ring Cycle of Richard Wagner. So And I love fantasy as a genre. Beowulf, anything like that. Oh, I just love it. So this is terrific for me to read. I have never gone to an opera house and actually seen live the opera. I've often listened to it here in my little home. One of my great things that I would love to do one day would be to find myself sitting in a great opera house and listening to the opera live of Richard Wagner. What is it, 11, 12 hours worth of opera? You usually do it over 3 nights. Oh boy, that would be a huge treat for me. I don't like flying, so I don't think I'll ever get to Beirut and be able to watch it live in its proper setting. But wow, if I could ever get to it, maybe at the Sydney Opera House. Wow, what a treat. I've listened to so many performances of Wagner's Ring Cycle now. I would love to hear and see the real thing, but we'll see. So this beautiful book that you've seen sitting over my left shoulder there in all my videos, this is the libretto of Richard Wagner's The Ring Cycle, my great work of non-fiction to share with you. I guess you could argue this is actually a work of fiction, isn't it? So I'm probably confusing my genres, but that's the way I do everything. I mix everything up and turn everything into an absolute mess. So sorry about that. You can argue amongst yourselves whether this is a work of fiction or non-fiction, but this is the work I wanted to share. Richard Wagner's The Ring Cycle. Oh, this was just such a fun video, such a fun tag to be involved with. The 2025 Nonfiction Book Tag. Thank you, Julie from Bookish Book Travels for coming up with this idea, and thank you to Julie and to Nicole from Nicole's Bookish Nook for tagging me to get involved in the fun. This was a lot of fun. I love reading nonfiction. I read as much nonfiction as anything else, including poetry. So nonfiction, yes, it's a big thing for me. I read a lot of it and I love it. So thank you for inviting me to take part in this tag and to share my love of nonfiction. Thank you and bye for now.